This video was brought to you by the wonderful people on screen here who support me over at Patreon. If you want to support this channel and what I do, then please check the link in the description or the link at the end of the video. So this was supposed to be the episode about Darth Plagueis' epistemology, but unfortunately working through that book is taking longer than I originally intended. So we're going to be dealing with a different character's epistemology, and this one's a bit harder to place. Alright, and now that we're in theme, let's do this. So, normally we'd be doing fan art here, but instead I'd like to go ahead and show off the merch designs that the wonderful Gaelic Nox has made for the channel. First, we officially have the living meme, Rule 63 Neko Suris, then Let's Do a Thing, which is of course followed by Very H. If you don't get any of those, well, I do live streams Mondays and Thursdays, and that's where you can get context for those. Anywho, moving on to Sans. I think it goes without saying that there should be a giant spoiler warning at the beginning of this video. If you haven't played Undertale, there be massive spoilers ahead. Now that that's out of the way, let's go over the premise of today's video. In the epistemology series, I like to take philosophical concepts and view them through the frame of fictional characters. The first episode we did was on Darth Bane and pragmatism, but today's video is not going to be about one epistemology, but two. Classically, Sans is viewed as a nihilist, but this is only partially true, as Sans is a nihilist born of fatalism. But first let's go over nihilism. One of the minds heralded as the father of existential nihilism is Nietzsche, who's most famously known for the phrase, "God is dead." Unlike many of his contemporaries who struggled with the ideas of philosophical existence because of the idea of God, Nietzsche instead attempted to frame his epistemology around a world that didn't contain one. He's really misunderstood in this, though, in that many people think that he means that God has been killed, or that God belief is largely gone, when in actuality the whole phrase "God is dead" stemmed from the erosion of fundamentalist readings of the Bible that were prominent in 19th century Europe. He largely wanted to find what the moral consequences were of God belief no longer being part of society as a whole. After all, when a society has determined its moral fiber based solely on the teachings of the divine, what do you do once that's missing? How does everybody find their moral fiber once there is no God to base it on? In this way, Nietzsche had to form an entirely different morality that was decoupled from divine sanction, rooting moral oughts in naturalism as opposed to divinity. In some ways, Nietzsche viewed morals as norms that rose to produce conformists. Essentially, if everybody in a herd happened to conform to the herd's morality, then only conformists to the herd would be bred. He was a bit of an individualist, however, because he did see that potential to become something else was in what he labeled the sick animals pregnant with a future. Through that potential, one would be born into a moral autonomy, or being beyond good and evil. This is something that can be seen with Sans, since he determines himself to be the arbiter of justice at the end of the game, judging your character based on the amount of bodies they've left behind in their journey. There's a common misconception with nihilism that a nihilist thinks that there is no meaning in the world at all. For Nietzsche, though, this couldn't be further from the truth. His view was that to attain meaning, one must be able to create meaning and value in a world in which all transcendent supports have fallen away. In this, he would argue that one would essentially find objective value and meaning in the lack of objective value and meaning. Once all transcendent values have been stripped away, you are left to construct your own and then have those objects to stand on instead. This also leads people to be able to create their own moral codes, and this is largely something that Sans does throughout Undertale, given that he'll be your friend knowing that you have the potential to slaughter everybody in the underground, but he will largely not impede your progress should you start killing everyone in your path, only leaving it to the end of the game to judge you. And it's only if you've slaughtered literally every living being in the underground that Sans will actually confront you for your actions, leading to one of the most nightmarish boss battles in video game history. Undertale does a very good job at punishing the player for being an asshole. But why was all objective meaning stripped away? For Nietzsche, it was largely the fact that fundamentalism was eroding, and many of the pillars that people stood by for morality and meaning were largely being stripped down. For Sans, however, he doesn't find his nihilism in God being dead, so much as in his morose understanding of fatalism. You see, in the world of Undertale, every time the player resets the game, every time the player dies and returns to a save, everything canonically in the world actually resets. It's a story beat as opposed to just a game mechanic. For instance, if you kill a character and then realize a few seconds afterwards that you didn't want to, and then go back to a previous save, the character will remember, even if it's just vaguely, that you did attempt to do that. Hell, there's even a character in the game that will accuse you of playing God, but Flowey would be a character for another day. The one exception to the vaguely remembering everything that has happened rule is Sans. While it's never directly mentioned in the game, it is shown through various cutscenes that is at least mostly aware of all of your escapades whenever you are saving your game over and over again, and this includes every time you've committed genocide or tried to kill any of his friends. If you enter his room in the game, it turns out that he has a book on quantum physics that contains a joke book inside, and inside the joke book is a book of quantum physics, and inside that is a joke book, and the cycle repeats. If you do go through the genocide route and end up having to confront Sans, he mentions that there were reports of timelines jumping back and forth that he'd been analyzing. Also, every time he kills you, and trust me, he will, he keeps a note of it in his head, because canonically, every time he kills you, you are in fact coming back, just not by any method of resurrection, but simply by rewinding time due to your character's determination. But because of the nature of this game, when you complete it, for better or worse, eventually you will have to reset the game if you want to play again. Sans knows this. He knows that whatever experiences he shares with you, the player, or any of his friends in the underground, will largely be reset. And also due to the fact that there's only a limited number of timelines, and these timelines are doomed to repeat themselves every single time that somebody picks up and plays the game, his mindset is largely stuck into something called fatalism, and it's what leads to his character's laziness, and ultimately nihilism. Since we covered nihilism in Nietzsche, let's talk about fatalism real quick. Fatalism is the idea that all events are subjugated to destiny. What that means is everything that can happen has been predetermined, and there's no way to really walk off that path. The only thing you truly have is an illusion of choice. This actually does dial back to Nietzsche a little bit, since he did name this particular idea Turkish fatalism in his book The Wanderer and His Shadow, in which he articulated that brand of fatalism as an attitude of resignation in the face of future events, so long as those future events end up being inevitable. In Sans's case, those future events are all but inevitable, whether or not all of his friends will be slaughtered by you, or saved and ultimately returned to the surface world, or any of the thousands of options in between where many of his friends will either end up surviving or dying at your hands. He knows that events are outside of his hands, and they're predetermined. Everything will happen at the will of the player, and even when it's done happening, it will reset ad infinitum. And before you start feeling bad, don't worry, Flowey was doing this too. In the world of Undertale, whoever has the most determination gets control of the timeline. You, the player, gain control of the timeline when you boot up your game. But canonically, when you're not around, that's when Flowey has control of the timeline. And trust me, he's killed everybody thousands of times. Luckily though, most of them don't remember it, but Sans is fated to, repeatedly, over and over again. As a result, throughout the game, he largely ends up coming off as incredibly lazy. The only real joy he gains in life is through playing pranks on people and spouting out puns. And if you guys ever wondered, yes, this character is in fact the reason why many of my thumbnails contain Comic Sans. It's just taken me 2 years since the inception of my channel to finally talk about the comic Sans. So now that we know that Sans is a nihilist born of fatalism, what actual actions does he take? Well, in the world of Undertale, monsters will be able to return to the surface, and thus the human world, if they can gain 7 human souls and use them to return to the surface world. There's a barrier between the humans' world and the underground after all. By the time you make it to the underground, 6 humans have already been killed, and all that's left is you. The first monster you encounter outside of the tutorial area is Sans. Technically, he should be bringing you to Asgore at the end of the game, so that they can escape and get to the surface world. But it does seem that Sans understands that even if he were to do this, everything would just reset anyway, meaning that the only thing left to do is have a little fun. After all, his encounters with you could either lead to you slaughtering all of his friends, or saving them, but ultimately neither option matters. It's all predetermined, and none of it has any objective meaning. Throughout the game, the things that you'll find Sans doing is either slacking off at his job, in so much as you can even argue that he has one, or, should you be running on a pacifist route, confronting the player every now and again to talk about their current life choices. He also seems to have the ability to teleport everywhere and can be seen in multiple places at once. Referring to the quantum physics book he has in his room, it seems that even though he can't manipulate time in the way that the player can, he does at least have some control over space, as far as his body is concerned at least. Also, if you do end up getting to the genocide ending of the game and fighting Sans, you'll see that he has only 1 health available to him. He can also only deal 1 damage. knowledge. This is because, again, without any objective meaning in his life, and his laziness born from seeing that all the events are predetermined, Sans doesn't do any work to try to better himself. But it doesn't seem to matter, considering that ultimately he's the strongest monster in the game, and has put many a player through their nightmares. What he lacks in strength, he makes up for in knowledge, since he does understand practically everything about all of the timelines, even if this has also led to his laziness. It also turns out that his efforts in trying to befriend you in the beginning of the game were born specifically because of his knowledge about your genocidal capacity. In his genocide dialogue, he mentioned specifically that he thought he could stop you peacefully by being friends with you. Ultimately, because of the predetermined nature of events, Sans decides that there's no good reason for trying to stop you, regardless of what your choices are. However, much like how Nietzsche finds meaning in the lack of meaning, Sans also finds his purpose in stopping you once all of his friends are dead. After all, if there's an infinite loop of you trying to stop him and him trying to stop you, then the player can't complete the game, and thus reset the timeline again, making him relive all of these events all over again. Ultimately though, Sans is an extreme example of existential nihilism, considering that he doesn't even take action, no matter how many moral wrongs the player commits. Unlike all of the other monsters that try to stop you in your path, should you choose genocide, he only attempts to stop you at the very end. Otherwise, he just judges you on your actions and tells you to go on your merry way, fighting back with only a snide remark or two if you even killed his brother. But now that we're on the morality side of the conversation, there is one more avenue that we have to tackle, and that is moral nihilism. Moral nihilism is the meta-ethical view that morality doesn't exist as something inherent to objective reality. This echoes Nietzsche's sentiments. A moral nihilist would say that killing someone, for whatever reason, isn't exactly right or wrong in and of its own. This can be seen whenever you do any of the various neutral runs, and Sans mentions that no matter how many of the monsters you killed, you probably did them in self-defense, even though in many cases he knows better. What you did isn't necessarily right or wrong. It's neutral. Only in the most extreme cases will he judge your actions worthy of his reciprocation. There are views of moral nihilism where all actions are only relative to their different possible outcomes. So whether or not something is considered a moral good or evil only has merit based on its outcome. And since for Sans the outcome is always going to be moot, it becomes incredibly hard for him to justify taking any actual action against the player, in, like I said before, all but the most extreme circumstances. All in all, I haven't really covered the entire story of the game Undertale, and that wasn't my plan here. My plan was to hopefully help you guys see a few epistemological frameworks through the lens of a character who I truly enjoy. After all, I've had a bone to pick with this topic for a while, since atheists are commonly called nihilists, even if that's not necessarily true. But what did you think? Do you think that Sans is a nihilist? Do you think that he's just a fatalist? Or, like me, do you think he's a combination of the two, where one ultimately led to the other? I welcome any and all discussions on the topic in the comment section below or on my Discord. But with that said, this has been my presentation on some of the concepts behind nihilism and fatalism as seen through the eyes of one skeleton. I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, insert end of video tagline here.